Hi guys, and welcome to another Sunday slot for teens and everyone and anyone else. This week we're going to be thinking a little bit about being ashamed and being embarrassed, and thinking about that in context to the gospel, so in context of the Bible. So I have been thinking about being ashamed or being embarrassed, which are kind of similar. And when I am embarrassed, my face goes super red, my palms start to sweat, and I sometimes get a tight chest if I'm really embarrassed and I'm kind of almost panic attacking you. Some of you might have a really similar experience to that when you get embarrassed, or you might be as cool as a cucumber when you get embarrassed, which I'm very jealous of. But everyone gets embarrassed or ashamed at some stage. In 2015, Madonna, lovely Madonna, must have had one of the most embarrassing moments of her life, where she fell off the stage at the Brit Awards in front of hundreds of people, as well as everyone watching on TV. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that's fine. I've got the little link below to the video, not to embarrass her anymore, but just so you know what context we're working in, where she just couldn't quite get her cape off in time, and obviously they were going to pull her back to pull off the cape, but because she didn't get the cape undone quick enough, she got pulled right off the stage. And it's a moment where everyone, I think, just like, oh, so embarrassed for her. And sometimes I think we've all been in those situations where someone has embarrassed themselves, or maybe you've done it as well, and you just feel like, oh, I want the ground to eat me up because it's just so embarrassing. But the point of that isn't to shame Madonna. It's just to show that we all do and say embarrassing things. A prime example is children. Children are quite embarrassing sometimes. And I've got a little challenge for you. So I would like you to name the top 3 things that are embarrassing that children do. So have a little think, write them down, pause the video. The top 3 things that are embarrassing that kids do. Let me tell you, one of them is not picking their nose in public. So rule that one out. Top 3 things kids do that are embarrassing. Okay, I'm going to hope that you've got like 3 little suggestions, 3 answers. Let me tell you that I had great fun Googling these things on the internet to see how embarrassing children really are. The first one that came up was pointing out a stranger's looks. That's something that is quite embarrassing if you've got children or you've been around children where they've pointed out someone's looks and they're not very discreet about it. That's the first embarrassing thing that children do. The second embarrassing thing that children do is staring intensely at a stranger. So they've locked onto someone and they just won't stop looking for no reason. They're just staring, which kind of in our culture we're brought up to that's rude. It's rude to stare. So that's the second embarrassing thing that children do. And then the third embarrassing thing apparently that children do is telling someone something private you said. So maybe they've heard something around the house, or they've heard something in a conversation, and then they've repeated that somewhere that they shouldn't have. That's another embarrassing moment from children and young people. So I wonder how good you did, probably depending on how well you know kids. But it's quite easy to share good things that we're not ashamed of, good things like exam results or good news about this, that and the other. But sometimes we're not as quick to share things that we think like we're a bit embarrassed about or a bit ashamed. Maybe you don't want to go home and tell your parents that you've had a detention at school because that's a bit embarrassing and you might feel a bit ashamed about it, but you would go home and tell your parents that you've had a really good grade on something or in a certain subject. And then this got me thinking about, am I ashamed of the gospel? which straight up answer, people would be like, no, of course I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Like, I'm not ashamed of telling people about Jesus. But when I actually sat down and thought about it, I might be. Am I embarrassed? Am I embarrassed about telling people about God because I'm scared of what they'll say about me? Because I'm saying something different to other people. Maybe you're in a context where you are the only Christian in school, in a workplace, at home, and you might feel a bit embarrassed, like, oh, if I bring up the Jesus thing again, like someone's gonna say something, or they're gonna try and kind of shame you into that you shouldn't have brought it up, and it's not, we don't need to hear it. But this guy in the Bible called Paul, Paul says this: I am not ashamed of the good news. It is the power God uses to save everyone who believes, to save the Jews first, and then to save the non-Jews. The good news shows how God makes people right with himself. God's way of making people right with him begins and ends with faith. And that is taken from Romans 1:16 to 17. What makes people feel ashamed? That got me thinking, what makes people feel ashamed? And am I ashamed of the gospel? If it's good news, which, we sometimes call it that, the good news, am I ashamed of sharing good news? Because that doesn't really make much sense. Let me try and put it in a little bit of context. Suppose a boy brags to his friends that he can outrun the skinny new kid on the street. So the kids set up a race, say once around the block. Both boys walk the route and see where all the obstacles are and where the turns are made. They line up. The kids from the street are all out watching, and someone says, "Ready, set, go." And the bragging boy is simply left in the dust. The skinny new boy finishes 40 or 50 yards ahead of the bragging boy. When that happens, it is very likely that the boy who bragged that he could beat the skinny boy feels ashamed. He feels that he has made a fool of himself. Suppose you put a lot of importance into how you look. Having your hair just the way it is supposed to be, and your clothes are in perfect taste. You are invited to a party and you check with people whom you think are reliable advisors about what to wear and how to look. But when you get there, you realise that you are totally wrong in the way you dressed. You are so embarrassed that you don't want to go into the room. We all know what it is to be embarrassed or to be ashamed. But what would keep you from being embarrassed or ashamed in situations like those? You could avoid being ashamed if you and your family and friends could always keep yourselves in the best light and never let anyone feel negative things about you. Because that would work. If no one felt anything negative towards you, you would never have a reason to feel embarrassed or ashamed. Now, when Paul says in Romans 1:16 that he is not ashamed of the gospel, does he escape being ashamed because he keeps himself in the best light? No. Exactly the opposite. Believing and preaching the gospel constantly put Paul in a bad light. Kind of put him in a lot of people's bad books because they didn't like what he was saying. It constantly kind of stirred up other people to shame Paul. So they wanted him to feel embarrassed about the gospel. You shouldn't be saying that. You should feel embarrassed that you said it. So when he was saying stuff about Jesus and about the love of God, people wanted him to feel ashamed and embarrassed because it wasn't the way. They hadn't heard it before. It's something new, and maybe they thought he was a little bit crazy. Now, some people might say it is the most loving thing in the world to tell the truth about the way of salvation, or to share about Jesus. But do we always make the most of opportunities when we could tell people about Jesus? Again, if we've got this great news, this good news about the love of God, why sometimes do we feel embarrassed about the news that we have? It's not like the situations that we've heard with the boy who bragged or the girl at the party. If we've got something good to share, should we be ashamed of it? The reason why Paul was so ready and willing to preach it, even where he ran a great risk of people like being horrible to him and like persecuting him, giving him a hard time, it was because it was the gospel of Christ he preached, and he wasn't ashamed of it. I just have a few questions to end on to help us reflect. How willing are we to preach the gospel? And we can take preach in a really broad sense. I don't want us to kind of just zone in on preaching as like telling, or maybe experiencing some things like people on the street corner. Let's kind of try and open up our brain into what preaching could be, and how willing then are we to preach the gospel? Are there any parts of the gospel we feel ashamed or embarrassed about? Are there any parts in the Bible that you're like, I don't want to tell people about that because that makes me feel embarrassed? So are there any parts of the gospel we feel ashamed or embarrassed about? And the last question is, what things stop us sharing the gospel? What things stop us sharing the gospel? So lots of the food for thought there. I hope that just helps you reflect a little. We don't have all the answers, but hopefully we're journeying it together and working it out as we go along. Hope that you have a really happy Sunday, really great week, whatever you're doing. Stay safe and stay well, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Bye guys.